Okay. All right, you heard it. That's the end of the formal part of our presentation, and we're going to do some talking up here and hear from the panelists on what each other had to say and look at some of these overlaps and some of these shared themes and what they're thinking. And it's interesting listening to all of you that we're doing this on the week that, the week after Sundance announced this new lineup in the midst of the new awards season. Strong Island got the Gotham Award, yay. Producer Jocelyn Barnes is there, so double yay. And, it's still an exciting moment. It was in March when this was envisioned, and it still is. And so, Raquel, Michael, where would you like to start in terms of following up some of these comments and ideas from all the authors and all the panelists? Any first thoughts?
So I was, as all of you were talking and presenting, I was closer. Okay. Yeah. One of the things that everyone talks about is sort of this, as Michael and I sort of casually refer to it, like this moonlight moment where that was the only thing anybody was talking about to the exclusion of everything else. And we're sort of entering this new sort of award cycle and Sundance, as Ruby mentioned. And so I'd sort of just like to throw it out there. What do you think are the media texts, the films, the television shows that are doing some really interesting work in whatever area, however you define interesting, that are essentially being obscured or sort of not being given the recognition that you would like to see them having?
While they're thinking, I'm going to throw it back to you, Raquel, because you talk in your piece about this question of quality television and what you think gets ignored with this obsession with so-called quality.
So my answer is going to be the same answer that I always give to anybody who knows me, which is nobody's talking about Love and Hip Hop, and that's the show. That's the show that I think should really garner some kind of close critical attention, and I mean that in terms of looking at the ways that the women on the show as sort of cast members or performers are sort of disrupting conventional representations of femininity for women of color, the ways that the aesthetics of that show have radically shifted since it emerged, since the birth of reality television. I mean, the shows look cinematic now. The ways that the women who appear on those shows sort of leverage their notoriety to actually make money in terms of social media sponsorships and things of that nature, and that's not even to talk about the content of those programs, which I don't know that there's a show on television right now that has more queer colors of character than Love and Hip Hop, and we're not talking about that in all of its sort of intricacies and problematic things as well, partly because it's in the metaphoric gutter of television, right? It's reality television, which we don't talk about in spaces like Lincoln Center, right? But that would be the text that I think is sort of just going under the radar that we should be absolutely engaging with and discussing.
Great. Who else wants to jump on that?
I'll jump in on that. I mean, I'll just throw out four objects four objects to kind of think about. Number one, if you have not heard about the New Negress Film Society in Brooklyn, you need to know about them. So write that down. You also need to know about the Black Aesthetic Group based out of Oakland. If you've not seen Anna Rose Holmer's The Fits, I mean, what have you been doing with your life? And finally, you have to see Yancey Ford's Strong Island. I think that, to me, there's some really interesting formal work that's going on. It may not be the work that so often there's an expectation of some kind of prescription of what black films must do. It is our job as fans of film, of critics of film, to not insist on what black film has to be. Our role is to see what it does and to understand what it does and to dial down the pre-mediated nonsense, okay? So.
Who, and with that, who dares speak?
I'll try. Well, I think what you just said about what black film could be, because I mean, part of my interest in I Love Cinema and perusing Kickstarter for failed campaigns is, what happens to the one and dones? What happens to those who keep trying to create, but keep kind of creating these trailers, these imaginatory spaces? What does it mean to have a speculative archive of fragments that tell stories, and let that also influence what we considered to be, formal aesthetic engagements with the medium? I mean, I showed the 2012 trailer, but the 2013 trailer stars Basketball Wives, Jennifer Williams. She was forced to watch French films, and she said, I don't know what was happening, but I'm trying. And she's wearing, dressed like Josephine Baker. Like, what's all happening even in these 3 minutes of this sort of imaginatory space of a film that is still in process, but we may never ever get to see from somebody who once had a breakthrough moment, just like this Moonlight moment, who isn't getting, the second time around, the third time around, that other people are able to. So I think the forms, the locations have to change, all of these things.
I just want to quibble. I mean, my quibble is based on this plastic thing, is to be very cautious of how and what. I think Michael's prescription, his point about not trying to prescribe, I think is really key, because I think we can easily sort of fall into this trope of, we see bodies that look like ours, we associate those and make them black films, and by doing that, we are also saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be about us, it doesn't necessarily have to feel like it's directed at us, i.e. like Dear White People, right? We don't have to necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to point toward us, or we don't necessarily have to identify, it doesn't necessarily have to resonate, but it just needs to have folks that look like us in it for it to count. And those objects that he names specifically reject those notions. So I think those are key. For me, talking about plastic and talking about the opposite of that, which would be cultural resonance and cultural specificity, I don't actually see full texts that actually do it that often. There are mostly shadows and ruptures and those moments where you see it. So the example that I used, Magic Mike XXL, it is not a black film by any stretch. But what I like about it, and the story that I often talk about with regard to it, is how crucial it is to find yourself called at in a movie. That moment when the freaking you the beat drops, and you suddenly are harkened back to 1994, and I am this young black girl in South Louisiana who's like, wait, you're playing a Jodeci song in the middle of a movie about these white strippers? What? Who? Right? That becomes a key moment. It is not about, it's not a black film, but it becomes about this space called Domina that is populated by these black women, these black Southern women in Atlanta, who are enjoying themselves and being entertained and are spoken to in a very key and direct way. So I think that becomes a strategy that we might think about, are the ways that films can direct toward you, that we can be interpolated, we can be sutured or called at or hailed as audiences, which is not a thing we often get.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think that, in television and thinking not just about a series, but particular episodes. So This Is Us, there's a father-son episode that is so resonant in terms of a cultural specificity in thinking about black manhood and whatnot. And so there are those moments, I think, in television that allow us to, imagine, differently. And I also want to make a plug for our colleague Imar Jean Christian, who has a platform called Open TV. And Open TV is a platform primarily geared towards queer people of color making television online and through the web series. And so that's another sort of moment of, production, distribution, exhibition that allows for a different archive to be manifested.
So I have another kind of a follow-up question to this, that there was a lot of abjection in what we saw in these clips today. And, given this moment that we're in, this moment of such violence and threat, what does it mean to have the sunken place be the dominant metaphor? What does it mean to have abjection as the form of threat? I don't know, does that prompt any thinking for any of you, or am I just off on a limb? I'm off on a limb.
I don't know, this isn't, it could be related to what you're saying, but it goes back to what Raquel was saying about love and hip hop. And I was wondering if you think that the present moment with he who will not be named in the White House and the sort of discussion of reality television and what it's done to us, do you think that that is going to affect how we talk about aesthetics of reality television now?
Interesting.
I mean, I think that the short answer is that we're not going to talk about the aesthetics of reality television, which is the thing we should be doing, right? I mean, what I try to get at a little bit in my essay, and this is to sort of answer this question, maybe to get at objection in your comment and question as well, Ruby, is, you know, when Michael and I were sort of talking about how we conceived of this, part of it came out of a frustration of feeling like Black media texts are always talked about in the exact same ways, right? So we're talking about it in terms of realism and authenticity, or what is the possibilities of this particular film to, like, I don't know, end racism? Like, I mean, that's sort of like how
how's it going to save us?
Yes, exactly. And what we don't get to talk about are things like affect and how things make us feel, or sort of formal questions of how they look, or sort of what baggage they carry with them from cinematic history or from television history. We don't talk about what does it mean to talk about Black representation, as Brandy talks about, in episodic television, which is a very sort of different thing than if we're talking about a feature-length film, right? My sort of fear is that this current political moment, we've grossly misunderstood reality television, so it becomes a very quick thing to say, it's a reality television president, without asking, like, well, what exactly does that mean, right? What are sort of what are the ways in which reality television appeals to our emotions and sort of calls for identification and disidentification, which are things that can be wielded in very scary ways, but that also provide space for empathy and identification and subversion. And so my fear is that we're not having that conversation because everyone thinks we already know what that genre is, right?
And did you want to say something, Rosemary?
Do I want to? I do, but not necessarily about either of these points. Well, I mean, I am interested in affect. I am interested in the way in which it sort of seems like we're all picking on Moonlight, when I know, I mean, a lot of us love Moonlight. But I think one of the things that really interests me is this question of Black cinematic affect and who and what gets to mobilize it within, recent Black cinema. And I think one of the things that I noticed, particularly with respect to conversations that people were holding around Moonlight, is the way in which sort of a kind of liberatory sexuality, right, really gets attached to certain subject positions at the expense of others. And I think that it's really important to understand that, I don't think it's enough to sort of, say that part of the issue that I was having with discussions around Moonlight was the sort of way in which sexuality came to belong to certain subjects and not others. And I think that it's really important to think about the ways in which gender and sexuality construct, at least I think, the cinematic diegesis in a lot of these films, and I think drive, right, a lot of the sort of structure of the diegesis in these films. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more one could say about affect, but I think gender and the sort of diffusion of maternal desire in Moonlight and in Get Out really becomes the sort of feature of, to go back to your thing about the sunken place. I don't think that we can think about the sunken place without thinking about the abstraction of the Black mother and of gender in some capacity. So.
I just wanted to I don't think Raquel and I might have spoken about this at some point. In terms of kind of premonitions, the kind of ways that we wanted to really compel people to kind of think as expansively as they could in terms of their object choices. I do know that there was an article that played in my head. It was an article that was in the New York Times that was a report from the Toronto Film Festival. And the article was discussing Moonlight, Loving, and Birth of a Nation. And the writer of this article rightfully ascertained that, you know, these are three different kinds of films, right? Right? That these are three different, so, but what really struck me about this article is that the writer concluded that because they were all three different kinds of films, or three different ways that he was capable of thinking about black film, that he then made the conceptual leap that we should not talk about race at all with these films, right? And then that just kind of reminded me, I got to stop reading the Times anyway. But I mean, it's that sloppy kind of thinking that, I mean, if you run into a problem where you see three different kinds of black films, the problem is not the films. The problem is you're dealing with a very simple category, okay? You need to reinvest in something much more discursive than holding on to the social category of race as applicable immediately to a film practice, right?
Well, that sounds, oh, go ahead. I was gonna try to push off from that, but
I was just going to
Go
say,
ahead.
to Raquel's point and to a couple of other points, I think that one of the things that is missing, and I know it's something I tried to mention at the end, was an investment in trying to theorize and understand black cinephilia. Like, there's a productive nature to black cinephilia, that there's creative practices that come from it, that come in multiple forms, feature, length, short film, etc. But there's a sort of a not theorization that, when I saw your clip with the Manton Moore, like, is that there's no sense that black filmmakers or people who are making black film have a sense of any kind of cinephilia, love of cinema that would produce a history of cinema and thus a knowledge of whatever came before them. And I think that's becoming a problem and that's what I love. I love cinema. It's all born out of Leslie Harris's cinephilia, all born out of her love of cinema. And so I think there's something there, to your point and your point. Yeah.
well, that's an equally great jumping off point, especially since we have a house of cinephiles here. So I want to start, we have less than 20 minutes left in the house. So I want to start hearing from some of the people here, because we have an amazing audience here. I'm sort of looking and seeing who's sitting here, and it's pretty impressive. So is there anything that any of you want to ask these panelists or say to these panelists? Yep. And here comes a mic for you.
Hi, thank you everybody for the great panel. Raquel, I have a question for you.
I don't think the mic is working.
Can anybody hear me? Yeah. Raquel, question for you. We see Mr. Oscar as the backdrop of the screen slide. I was just wondering whether you worry at all that Oscar veneration by the industry might have a negative effect and help calcify types of ideas of how black cinema should be, because we've had one major success here and there, and perhaps adjacent to that, how you feel about the overall effect and impact of the Oscars So White campaign.
Okay. So, yes. I think part of the problem with sort of the reason that Michael found that image, I want to give credit to him for the image in the introduction of Barry Jenkins' fist clutching the Oscar, which
you should thank Mexico Game 68 for that image.
Which we thought of in our discussion as being a somewhat ironic image, because on the one hand it's like, yay, I did it, but if you also watch what happened with that, it's like he's also sort of clutching it, because maybe they're going to take it away. I'm going to also defer to Kristen on this, because she's our media industries expert on the panel. I think there's a problem with sort of this unproblematic assumption that the Oscars connote anything besides sort of the politics of the Academy, and sort of how well one runs a campaign to get an Oscar, which is not my territory, but that's Kristen's territory. the Academy Awards always reward the same type of films. It's always prestige films. It's always historical films. It's all, you know, it's, and in that regard, if you are a black cast film, it's I can already predict what types of films are going to sort of gain traction there. The problem was that we don't talk about what that means in terms of production. We don't talk about, like, what is the significance of winning an Oscar. You know, theoretically, it creates more roles and more power for the person who wins, but that's not true. I mean, Halle Berry talks about not being able to really find good roles after she wins her Oscar. We know that the sort of inherent racism of the Academy and of the film industry means that this is a very it's an empty symbol at best, and that's to take nothing away from the people who work hard and win and should rightfully feel joy at that celebration of their accomplishment. But it is not an unobjective measure of quality or merit. You know, Spike Lee has said before that Do the Right Thing came out the same year as Driving Miss Daisy, and Driving Miss Daisy won Best Picture. And so what does that tell us about, like, the Academy, right? I think that we need to sort of interrogate our own investment in these spaces and our investment in their ability to connote quality. You know, in some ways, some of the best films I've ever seen have never even gotten on the radar of the Academy, right? And some of the worst films I've seen have won Best Picture. So,
Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah. Is there anybody else out there? Yeah. Somebody there, and then someone back here.
Thank you so much for this. I was wondering, this is kind of a question for everyone, if you guys could say a little bit more about where pleasure fits into this, especially in terms of aesthetics and form, because I'm thinking about the clips that you've seen and, you know, that moment in Magic Mike and Love and Hip Hop, and that I'm wondering just where maybe pleasure might help us distinguish between what, like, young experimental, like, black filmmakers and TV showrunners, and like what's different, like how they're not repeating the sort of normal experimental modes like aesthetic alienation and things like that, like where fun might help us think a little bit more about what black film or black form does.
Great question.
Oh, I was going to respond, but I didn't have anything to say about fun. One of the things I was going to say was, I mean, it occurs to me that what I was really trying to say earlier about the sort of privileging of sexuality in relation to Moonlight is that, right, I mean, I think what we need to sort of make room for and that we don't have room for is the sort of multiple fields of desire within a specific film, right? So I think that the fact that Little Chiron Black, right, is the only sort of, and, you know, Kevin are the only two who are sort of like, you know, primarily allowed to feel desire for one another, and their desire is, you know, primarily the sort of focal point of the film. Well, why does the mother not, right? Why is the mother presumed to be sort of, you know, sexless and not full of desire, not acting out of desire? And I think there should be room for desire and pleasure to be read in multiple ways and at different registers within a single film. And, you know, I think that for me is a problem.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit of that. Hey, Lauren. So, you know, this Cinema in the Wake project kind of began for me before Christina Sharp's book had come out. I was thinking a lot about Kevin Everson's Ears, Nose, and Throat. I was thinking a lot about Khalil Joseph's work, and of course I was thinking about AJ's Dreams Colder Than Death and Love is a Message, The Message is Death as well. And so for me, there was something formally that was speaking to this notion of people invested in a kind of pleasure in terms of film form. That even though the content is so distressing, I was very interested, and again, as I was kind of saying, I mean, what happens when you talk about, or when you put Black Death on the screen, and it's not with this expectation that, okay, I'm going to show you a Black Death, and it's going to guarantee justice. Well, you know, if you look back at lynching photographs, that's never went down. Okay, there's plenty of documentation about injustice and murder. So what else can we say then about Black Death? And that for me has become interesting in terms of a lot of the experimental work that's being done, which is clearly people who are invested in film form and also thinking of reimagining a kind of politics around film aesthetics. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that just briefly? Because it goes also to what you were saying in terms of cinephilia, Samantha. I think that it's sort of on both sides, or all sides. So it's looking at these filmmakers who have pleasure in what they're doing, even though the images might be disturbing, and also the pleasure that we take in watching film and thinking about film and talking about film and sometimes teaching, and so that cinephilia is there, right? It's just a matter of also then sort of talking about it and coming back to things like aesthetics with and thinking through films formally and politically, and that can be the pleasure, is the politics as well.
And Raquel, Brandy, Kristen, and I we were on a panel, Makes Me Feel Some Kind of Way, thinking about the inherent pleasures of various media texts in terms of fun, in terms of joy, collectivity, public intimacies, thinking through Lauren Berlant's ideas of all the pleasurable ways that particularly Black women experience these kinds of texts that can be considered fraught or problematic or anything like that. And I think there's people sort of thinking through these forms and aesthetics.
Yeah, and I also want to point to the audio visual. So thank you for that Jodeci moment, Kristen. But in thinking about the role of the sonic, right, and sort of the musical terrain. So I'm thinking about, TV shows that are based about, on the music industry, whether that be Empire or even Atlanta. But these shows that create some kind of, sonic terrain or atmosphere that allows us to, identify in a different way, move in a different way in terms of its resonance.
Yeah, and I like that word fraught, because I think that there's a way in which we hold on to what we love in films and ignore the parts that are problematic, and that audiences have always done that. And why should those of us here in this room be any different? So I really applaud that. Now, we could probably just have one or two more questions. There was one in the back there. I don't know if the mic got to you. Great, thank you. And then one over there, great.
How you doing? My name is Jamal Lassiter. I just want to start off by saying thank you to all of you guys, because you really, really just expanded my mind. Also, thank you to Brandy. Is that Brandy? Brandy? No, the one next to Brandy. I apologize. I apologize.
You want sparkles.
Now, my mother and my sister told me that they were going to see Magic Mike like a year ago, and I was like, "Oh, go ahead." Now that I know what it is, I will get home and ass whoopings will be handed out. But altogether, when it comes to, I really appreciate the perspective about the Love and Hip Hop as well, because shows like that I really don't watch. I really don't stay off of social media. I feel like I'm a Black director. I'm writing my first script right now, but I still consider myself a Black director. But it stumps my creativity. Just watching stuff like that, and it just, it's not something that I hang around a lot of intellectual Black people, and that's what I see, that's what I hear, that's what I want to display in my future career. But what do you think is the main thing that's holding Black cinema up in Hollywood when it comes to, do you think it's funding, or do you think it's funding because it's such a gray area and nobody can relate, or do you think it's, I don't know, whatever you're thinking of?
So I wrote a piece, I gave a presentation at a conference this year, but I think it sort of is generally applicable to Moonlight and everything, and the title of it was called "Sometimes It Takes a White Man," and the thinking behind "Sometimes It Takes a White Man" is that the question of what produces Black cinema. If you really want to talk about the backstory of Moonlight, we can proselytize all day about the content. We can proselytize and witness about how it made us feel when we're sitting in that room. But how does it actually get to you? Well, it gets to you because of a white man, named Brad Pitt, right, who has a production company called Plan B. And it works and it functions because they are in production or distribution with a company called A24, which is run by all white people. And these people decided that in order to make this movie something, they're going to put it in every white film festival from the beginning of the film festival circuit, starting at Telluride, and they're going to work it all the way through to Toronto, to New York Film Festival, to BFI, to Palm Springs, because what they know is if we want to actually make this something, we need to make sure that white people see it so that it will be something valuable, not just for the short-term effect of getting an Oscar, which was a part of the campaign for sure, but also so that Barry Jenkins and his cast and crew will have future employment. So if you can work with them, and if they put themselves through the paces of getting this work done and putting their time in, and if they let Brad give the presentation at the Golden Globes, presenting this project that he has been involved in, that has his name on it, and that has his stamp of approval as one of the CEOs in this business, then that is how Barry Jenkins then moves from Best Picture to now working with Megan Ellison and Annapurna on his next project. That is how this project works. That is how this works. That is how Ava DuVernay moved from independent filmmaking through Sundance, which sometimes it takes a white man named John Cooper and Robert Redford, to moving to a white man named Brad Pitt at Plan B to get Selma done. So, that's real talk. That is how it works. Yes, self-funding and Kickstarter and all these products and projects work and they function. But we also have to sort of think bigger. And this is one of the key things that I often get frustrated with black audiences about, because you get stuck in the content and you forget about how the thing gets made. So you get stuck thinking about a black man in Star Wars and a white woman in the lead, thinking that that's what makes $1 billion. And it's a fact that, Star Wars is a property that is going to make $1 billion if you put stick figures, if you put bars of soap, it doesn't matter, that this is a property, right? So it's important that we we think bigger and we think about the actual production process and the actual industrial practices that shape this content, and we think about who and what is in charge. So if you want to be, if you want to make your 12 Years a Slave, who do you talk to? Well, again, a white man named Brad Pitt, who's going to go to some financiers like Arnon Milchan, so that Steve McQueen can make the project that he wanted to make, because that's how that happens. You put that together with Michael Fassbender, another white man, and here we go, on and on, right? So this becomes this practice that of most success, that is of the last 5 to 7 years has been most successful. But, so that would be my answer.
Okay, we've got the mic already traveled somewhere. Who has it? Okay, go.
Hi, sorry. My name's Kaylin, and my question is for Raquel. And it's in regards to the DP's comment on Moonlight and the cinematography wanting to play a role in elevating the film. Would you still have the same sentiments had the DP have been black?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would, because and this is no shade to Moonlight. I think Moonlight's a fantastic film and it's beautiful. But there was in the interview with the cinematography also said they made a conscious decision not to do it in cinema verite style. They didn't want it to look sort of like a documentary, right? Which is something that Dee Reese does in Pariah. There's lots of sort of shots from around corners and things like that. But they wanted it to sort of have this sort of gloss, right? This connotation of quality. And I think that's fine. I don't have any issues with that. But it was saying that we have to do that because the content is about these queer black men living in the hood. That was the sort of underlying racial politics that I thought needed to be called out. Why do particular types of images need to be quote unquote elevated, right? Unless there's sort of this tacit assumption that they're already degraded, right? And why are they degraded? Because of their class and sexuality and because of race. And that's the stuff that sort of drops out of the conversation when we just talk about how beautiful of a film it is, right? I think it is beautiful, and I like to see beautiful films, but I also want to think about the politics of how things become legible as beautiful, right? And so much of this goes back to sort of classic Hollywood filmmaking. Essentially, you know, Moonlight looks like a European art film, and we should think about why that becomes sort of our standard for what makes something good. So yeah.
Can I follow up on that a little bit? Because one of the interesting things is I was just thinking about the flip side of that too, when it happens the other way, with something like the Florida Project or Tangerine, right? Where depending on who makes it, sometimes you can flip it and have the aesthetics go the other way to make, and then people talk about how wonderful it is and how you feel, you know, close to the characters and all that other sort of stuff. I think this is a really interesting point that you're working through.
Yeah, I have a question. Whoops. I have a question. If this won't stop. Won't stop. Yeah, that's, I have a question for the housemaster. Can we get 5 more minutes? Because we just reached our time. Yes? Oh, is that a yes? Oh, okay. We're at our set time, so we're now going into overtime. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to hear there's so many arms went up. Let's hear all the questions, and then if there's time, we'll answer a couple of them. Can we do that? Okay, wherever the mics are, you're on it. Okay, who has the mic now?
I have the mic.
Okay, go and then pass it on.
Oh, it's my question? Oh, sorry, I thought somebody else. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting about some of the presumptions around. I thought what you said was amazing, and it's very true around the mechanisms of making film in the mainstream media. But there are those of us, and many who are making films which are either an antidote or are not very interested in kind of entering those kind of spaces. I'm thinking particularly what you're talking about in terms of a lot of stories that just will not get to that space. They just won't. So the spaces are less apologetic. They're not interested even in the massive distribution. They're interested in bringing stories to the surface. And sometimes those stories will, by their very nature, be marginal or be anti-aesthetical or in other ways. I mean, even queer cinema, you talk about, Watermelon Woman by Cheryl Dunye when it came out. Nobody wanted to know about that apart from those who were interested in new wave queer cinema in the 90s. But now it's venerated as a classic movie from the 90s if you're working in film studies. So there are ways of intervening in the culture as a sort of a filmmaker which aren't necessarily to do with just seeing what the white man can do for us. So I just wanted to hear about that because the messiness, the sense that you are not necessarily interested in the ways in which film is being made. For example, you mentioned European cinema happened to be from Europe, so that being a standard is not one thing we see over there. We see the American commercial standard very highly. So could you speak to the messiness of I wouldn't call it independent filming, but different kinds of image making and the value of that, please?
Great question, and we're going to keep assembling questions till we can get to a few answers.
This might be really informal, but I have a question, even though I work here.
Go for it. Go for it.
I am on the clock, but at the same time, I am a black filmmaker, and this is really illuminating, so I just want to thank you at first. But I just want to if you guys could talk a little bit about tentpole and franchise filmmaking as it relates to blackness. I know, Brandon, you mentioned Star Wars. We have Black Panther coming out in February, a plethora of other things. So I want to know if you guys could just talk a little bit about that and how it relates to each other. Sorry. Who else has a question?
All right. Okay. We're putting this on the list. We've got it. We're assembling a list here, and we've got 2 mics. Go ahead.
Yeah.
The one who has it.
It's another Brit. Sorry, we seem to be surrounded in this audience. My quick question was back on that funding piece. If the aim of all cinema is to try and attract funding, which then allows films to be made, do you feel you do yourself a disservice by calling it black cinema, which by default boxes it in terms of what a producer might feel or what someone who's looking to finance a film might think? And is that something that you should consider and look at in terms of how you position black cinema itself if that at the moment doesn't always get the funding that you expect to get the films made?
Great. Okay, these are great questions. We're going to keep going. We will accept some from people with American accents as well.
I just wanted to just make a comment with respect to the cinematography of Moonlighting. One of the things that hasn't been talked about tonight and I noticed it in the clip from Andrew Dosunmu also, is the influence of Djibril Mamati Diop, filmmaker from Senegal, whose influence in cinematography has been acknowledged by Arthur Jaffa and Bradford Young. And I would argue that actually the cinematography in Moonlight is derivative, in fact, of Djibril.
Great, great. Yep. There's another hand down here, and who has the mic now? Go ahead. We have two mics, don't we?
My question concerns this particular moment and the fact that all people creating black art do not speak English. So what is this as an international moment and as an opportunity for dialogue across not only national but linguistic grounds as well?
Okay, great. Okay, final questions. Yep, down here, and then we'll hear from the panel.
Thank you for mentioning Mambeti, because I wanted to get at the question of who is allowed to be avant-garde. To mention, it takes a white man. It took Martin Scorsese to get Tuki Buki out on DVD finally. And in relation to what television shows are not acknowledged, to point out the Eric Andre show and Loiter Squad, which are these avant-garde strange comedies late on Adult Swim that people don't talk about. Everyone go home and watch Loiter Squad, 12 Years a Slave, because that sketch is amazing. And one final point is something like Vine, which is an alternative to television, and then gets canceled because it can't make money. And I guess to answer my own question, I'm going to stop ranting, sorry.
Go for it.
Well, someone like Beyonce gets to be really avant-garde, but Julie Dash doesn't get work for a while. Someone like Death Grips gets to be really avant-garde, but they're relegated to this niche in terms of their music videos and who their audience is. So who gets to be avant-garde when you're talking about black cinema and black joy, or anger, transgression, things like that?
Great. Yeah, one last one there. Go ahead. Yeah, it's right there. Wait for the mic.
Okay, Netflix as a space that's sort of, to me, is semi-TV, semi-cinema. I was so glad that Dee Reese got heavily publicized with her second effort. So I had this anticipation looking at it. I can't say that I was overwhelmed with the movie. And I felt like I don't know where her voice was in this movie.
Are you talking about Mudbound or Bessie?
I'm sorry, Mudbound, if I didn't say that already. And I just, what my main sort of problem with the film was the moment, somebody spoke about moments of violence, and, you know, I could go on about the horrible scene, not to end on that note, but I'm just like, did we need to see it so graphically, basically, in 2017? And I'm not saying let's like bury history at all, but at the same time, like, when does it cross a certain line, like visually, aesthetically?
Okay, thanks.
And was she in charge of that moment?
Good. Okay, I think we have a great array of questions. I'm not sure which of them you all feel like answering.
Two?
Good, go for it.
I can answer two in like one shot. Okay.
All right.
So the question of like calling these black films, if there's like more than two black people, it's a black film, essentially. I mean, and I say that because like Paramount basically pulled back and got very skittish about Coming to America because of like the Jerry curl jokes they thought was too culturally specific, to Kristen's point, right? And so I think that we need to retain that language. Whether we call it a black film or not, the racism sort of this studios and studio executives guarantees it's going to be treated as a black film and everything that means, right? To Anthony's point, which I thought was a great question about what gets treated as, what gets to be avant-garde, right? What my thing about Moonlight is it's about the discourse around it, right? That's what I want to point out, that the discourse in talking about this as an art film obscures and elides and erases all of the other influences by people of color. And so we don't get to talk about those film practices as avant-garde or experimental or cinematically pleasing because we're too busy trying to validate that film via sort of a known quantity.
Great.
Yeah, I want to speak to the avant-garde point real quick. So I'm thinking here of Atlanta. I'm thinking about the number of text messages I got after the first episode of this is the blackest thing I've ever seen, right? And so I was like, I'm intrigued. Let me watch this. What is the blackest thing you've ever seen? And I watched it, and I was like, yeah, it's mighty black, but it's also formally highly experimental. And the thing which really struck me was, why are people incapable of thinking of Atlanta in its experimental form? Has everything to do with, I think, the way sometimes that black film isn't even thought of as art, right? So you're right, that the presumption of a black avant-garde is sometimes a part of a larger issue of the presumption that black film or black filmmakers aren't artists.
And I would add to that to say that Atlanta's not a film, it's a TV show, right? And so there's an interesting way to think about sort of televisuality in relation to the cinema, right? And other sort of understandings of quality and the avant-garde. And to answer the sort of question preliminarily about Mudbound, what's interesting is that I watched Mudbound on Netflix in my home. I'm assuming that it was maybe different. There was a different scene with spectatorship if you watched it in the theaters. But I think there's an interesting question about Netflix and other platforms in terms of binging logics and what does it mean to binge, right? Anti-black violence. And so that's a question, that deals with TV as a medium in terms of its seriality, right? And how we sort of, understand, the sort of ethics of watching.
So this is a question of what's recuperable also?
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to say something really quickly, which is a kind of response to Kristen. You're mapping the lovely sort of like arc of Plan B, and it takes a white man and the sort of network of white men. But the flip side of that is, right, not only does it sometimes take a white man, but it also sometimes takes a John Ridley. And I think that, thinking about, the sort of black screenwriter for 12 Years a Slave, who also sort of worked with, Plan B in that way. But thinking about, specifically with respect to the question about Mudbound and violence and the sort of depiction of violence and its flirtations with sort of rampant anti-black, violence and images of Black Death, what is the sort of like entanglement, right, between sort of, a sort of white apparatus, production apparatus, and, right, sort of black in this case, screenplay writers who are sort of, right, scripting scenes, and also not scripting scenes, because the opening scene of 12 Years a Slave was actually not in the script for the film, interestingly enough. But I just wanted to kind of think about that too.
And also, I would say it's about also expanding I think like Michael's work challenges us all to do, which is the questions that we ask of black film, of what film blackness can be, of how we conceptualize, bodies on screen and the ways in which they're represented. I think there's a fetishization of, at the same time, of the avant-garde as being meaningful, because when I'm not talking about like I love cinema, I'm talking about terribly great sports films, which are commercial in all these different kinds of ways. And I think that there's aesthetizations around value and what and how we can quantify value in new ways if we ask new questions about what blackness can be, how capacious the term, the modalities, the motion, the articulation of it. Across different kinds of medias, and genres. And so, yeah. And also to Raquel's point, if people see black people, it's okay that it's also called black. I think that was a big problem. When Eve's Bayou came out, what did they say? It's too good to be a black film. So we don't have to bypass, we don't have to transcend blackness to get some elsewhere. Where we are is good enough.
To the tentpole question, are you thinking about Black Panther?
Of course.
I figured. You know what? I'm not gonna wreck your parade. If you enjoy it, if you like it, I love it. I would just say based on what I've been working on and thinking about, it feels awfully damn plastic, and in the way that it becomes really about images. I mean, like the excitement about that hashtag that I won't name is that it is so about like the images. Look at her flinging a sword, and look at him, and look at Wakanda, this fictional place where Chadwick is practicing language, practicing like an African dialect that in a place that doesn't actually exist. But he's like, I'm not trying to be colonized in a place that doesn't exist, right? Like it really becomes about image, and it really becomes about that. And what I really, again, I am hashtag Team Wet Blanket. What you need to remember is that this is a Marvel property that is owned by Disney, and that this is a global property that has got to reach the entire world. So as revolutionary as you might think it may be to have him sit in that chair and be reckoning images of Huey Newton, at the same time, it's got to speak to China and Japan too. And they don't care about Huey Newton in the same ways, right? Like they may not. They may, but they may not. So I think you also have to think about Kevin Feige and what he needs to get done. And so there are limits and parameters to what Ryan Coogler can do. So what's going to happen, what I anticipate is there's going to be a lot of black audiences thickening what that film is. And that's that's fine. But just realize that that's your labor. That's not what's in the text, because that can't be what's in the text. So yeah, Black Panther So Lit is going to be plastic as hell.
Well, I'm not sure that's where we want it to end up, but that is where we're ending up. Thanks a lot. Great night. Thank you, all of you.